I first heard the clapping at 11:42 p.m. It's not loud or sudden the way applause usually is, but measured and deliberate. Two slow hands meeting in the dark from somewhere down the hallway, and I remember smiling at first because the human brain is generous with explanations when it wants to stay calm, telling me it was the television or pipes, or the house settling the way old houses do when they cool at night. Yet even as I stood there in the kitchen with the lights off and the refrigerator, humming like a nervous animal, something in my chest tightened with the quiet certainty that the sound had weight, intention, timing, and that it had waited for me to stop moving before it began. I didn't answer it. I stood very still, counting breaths, listening for a follow-up that didn't come. And when the silence stretched just long enough to convince me I'd imagined it, the clapping returned, one beat, pause, another beat slower this time, as if adjusting to my attention. I whispered hello without raising my voice, hating myself the moment I did, and the house swallowed the word whole. No echo, no response, just the soft tick of the clock resuming its authority over the room. I slept poorly that night, dreams, filled with empty theaters and unseen audiences, and when morning came, I laughed it off in the mirror. Practiced the version of myself that makes jokes about nerves and age and imagination. The Robin who survives by softening edges before they cut too deep. The second night, the clapping moved closer. I was brushing my teeth when it started, when 2 doors away this time. Coming from the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, the one we never used after my wife died because it smelled like her shampoo. No matter how often I aired it out, and the sound was unmistakable now. Skin on skin, not pipes or wood or machinery. Applause without enthusiasm, applause without joy. I turned off the faucet and listened, my mouth full of mint and dread, and I realized something that made my hands shake. The rhythm matched my breathing. When I inhaled, the pause lengthened. When I exhaled, the hands met. I backed away from the sink, my reflection blurring as tears pooled without permission, and the clapping stopped the moment I stopped breathing on purpose. What? My chest locked tight until my vision sparked. When I finally gasped, the sound answered immediately. Sharper now, closer still, like a teacher acknowledging a correct response. I didn't open the door. I didn't say her name. I didn't even think it. Not all the way. Because somewhere between the second clap and the third, a memory stirred that I hadn't earned yet: a hospital room. A small audience of doctors and machines. My wife's hand slipping from mine while a monitor applauded my failure with steady beeps, and I understood, with a cold, nauseating clarity, that this thing wasn't clapping to celebrate. It was clapping to measure. The third night it clapped back. I was on the couch. Lights dimmed, a comedy rerun playing quietly in the background because silence had become hostile territory, when a thought crossed my mind that I shouldn't have entertained, not even for a second. What if it's just asking for something simple? The clapping started immediately, sharper and faster, as if the thought itself had been loud enough to hear. And before I could stop myself, I brought my hands together once, just once, softly, stupidly. A reflex from a life spent on stages where applause was a language you learned to speak back to. The response was instant and violent. The spare bedroom door rattled. The clapping erupted into a flurry of overlapping hands, not chaotic, but layered, precise. Like multiple people hitting the same beat from different distances, and the sound rushed down the hallway toward me, compressing the air until my ears rang. I froze, heart hammering, palms stinging from that single answer, and the clapping ceased all at once, leaving behind a silence so dense it pressed against my skull. Then I heard her voice, not clearly, not fully, just enough to hurt Robin. It came from the spare bedroom, filtered through wood and memory. My wife's voice lifted from the last voicemail she'd ever left me, the one I couldn't delete because deleting felt like killing her twice, and my knees buckled as grief surged, up with a violence I hadn't felt in years. "I'm here." The voice continued softly, testing cadence, testing pitch. And I knew that whatever lived in that room had learned applause the same way it had learned her voice. By watching what made me respond, I didn't go to the door. I sat on the floor and wept instead, my hands pressed flat against the carpet, refusing to clap, refusing to give it the rhythm it wanted. And the voice faded with a sound like disappointment, replaced by a single slow clap, alone this time, like a judge calling order. The fourth night, the house joined in. I woke to the sound of clapping everywhere at once, not loud but omnipresent. Like rain you don't notice until you realize you're soaked, and I lay there paralyzed as the walls answered the sound with small, sympathetic creaks, the floorboards ticking in time, the vents breathing in a pattern that matched the beat. I understood then that the room wasn't the source, it was the amplifier. The clapping wasn't applause, it was echolocation, a way of mapping my presence, my reactions, my weak spots. Shh. I rolled onto my side and pressed my ear to the mattress, listening to the house's bones, and I heard something worse than the clapping. A pause, an expectant hush, the kind you get when an audience knows the next line and is waiting to see if you'll deliver it. I didn't. I stayed still. I stayed silent. I let the moment pass without performance. By morning, clapping had retreated back into the spare bedroom, sulking, measured again. And I called a contractor under the pretense of a renovation, telling myself I'd seal the room, rip it out, turn it into something ordinary. But when he arrived and stood at the end of the hall with his clipboard, he frowned and said, "You sure this room's here?" I laughed too loudly and led him closer, and we both stopped short when the hallway ended 3 feet sooner than it had the night before. The spare bedroom door replaced by uninterrupted wall, paint seamless, no frame, no handle, no sign it had ever existed at all. That night, the clapping came from inside my chest, not literally nothing so crude, but from the space where breath and memory overlap. A phantom rhythm I couldn't escape no matter where I went in the house, and I realized with a sickening calm that the room didn't need a door anymore because it had learned the most important thing. I'd taught it how to get inside without being invited. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded tightly together, nails digging into skin, and I whispered the only rule that mattered, the one I'd learned too late and too well. If it asks you to perform, refuse. The clapping slowed, tested. The boundary then answered with something new, a scrape, a drag. The sound of something heavy being rearranged just out of sight, and I understood that this was no longer about applause or voices or rooms, but about consent disguised as participation. When the clapping finally stopped near dawn, I didn't feel relief. I felt watched, because silence, I'd learned, wasn't the end of the show. It was the encore being planned. I thought the worst part would be learning to ignore the clapping, once it moved inside me, but the truth was uglier and more intimate than that. Because ignoring a thing that has learned your rhythm doesn't starve it, it only teaches it patience, and patience, I discovered, was the room's strongest muscle. The morning after the contractor failed to find the spare bedroom, I walked the house with a tape measure and a notebook like a man trying to prove his own sanity in court, measuring walls that had held doors the night before, pressing my palms, flat against paint that felt warmer in one narrow rectangle, as if memory itself had been sealed in behind it. And I told myself that houses lie all the time, that grief warps floor plans, that the brain edits for mercy. But even as I wrote down numbers that refused to reconcile, I could feel the phantom applause pulsing in my sternum, a soft metronome ticking whenever my thoughts drifted toward performance. I showered with the water as hot as I could stand, counting breaths the way I'd learned to count beats on stage when nerves threatened to hijack timing. And the clapping matched me there too, slowing when I held my breath, resuming when I let it out, like a mirror with intent. I dressed without looking at myself, made coffee without tasting it, and kept my hands clasped together until my fingers cramped, because I'd learned the hard way that hands are invitations. The house tested me all day with absences. Sounds that should have been there weren't. The refrigerator hum fell silent for minutes at a time. The clock stopped ticking whenever I stood in the hallway. My phone refused to ring even when I called it from the landline, and when I finally got a text from my sister asking if I was okay, the screen stuttered, and the message arrived without punctuation. It's flattened into something oddly formal, as if written by someone who knew the shape of words, but not their weight. I didn't answer. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote one sentence on a scrap of paper and slid it beneath the wall where the spare bedroom had been, not as a message but as a marker, a line in the sand. I am not performing. The paper slid back an inch on its own, careful, polite, like a rebuttal. That night, the clapping didn't start with hands. It started with the house clearing its throat. A low, preparatory creak traveled through the beams, a gathering hush, the kind you hear when a crowd senses the lights dimming. I was ready this time. I turned off every lamp except the one over the sink and sat with my back to the wall. Eyes on the dark hallway, hands tucked beneath my thighs where they couldn't betray me. The first clap came from the floor, a dull impact, then another from the ceiling, then a third from inside the vent above the stove. Each one a little closer to my heartbeat than the last, mapping me in 3 dimensions. I didn't move. I didn't think. I let my breath fall into a shallow, ugly pattern that wasn't worth copying. The clapping paused, recalibrated, and then tried something new, cadence. Not applause now, but a count. 1, 2, 3. A conductor's baton, tapping the stand. Waiting for the orchestra to come in. Not tonight, I whispered without sound, shaping the words against my teeth and letting them die there. And the count stopped with a petulant scrape that made the hairs on my arms rise. I felt the house lean. That's the only way I can describe it, like a crowd shifting weight to see better, and then the voice returned. My wife's again, softer than before, practiced. "Robin," it said, "from everywhere and nowhere. You don't have to be afraid. We can do it together." The temptation hit like a sucker punch, because fear isn't what makes you answer. Love is. Love and habit and the reflex to complete a pattern when someone hands you the first half. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth until it hurt and pictured her the way she was when she was alive. Not as a recording, not as a voicemail, but as a woman who laughed offbeat and hated applause because it always felt like a verdict. And the picture steadied me enough to stay silent. The voice waited. Then, frustrated, it slipped, the warmth dropping out of it like a mask falling to the floor. "You owe us," it said, plural now, flat and hungry. The count resumed. 1, 2, 3. I stood up slowly, because sudden movements are applause of another kind, and walked to the place where the spare bedroom had been, laying my palm against the warm rectangle of wall. "You don't get to rehearse me," I said quietly, not naming it, not rising to meet it. The wall vibrated in response, a thrumming applause building just beneath the surface. And I understood then that the room hadn't disappeared. It had condensed, folded in on itself like a lung collapsing to survive, waiting for me to supply air. I leaned my forehead against the paint and did something I hadn't done since my wife died. I told the truth without ornament. "I'm done," I said. "There's nothing left to see here." The vibration faltered. The applause stuttered. For a heartbeat, my heartbeat, not its metronome. I thought it might work. It didn't. The house answered with a memory instead. The lights flared, and the hallway stretched. And for a breathless moment, I was standing in a theater I recognized down to the smell of dust and velvet. The seats full of faces I couldn't quite see. The stage empty except for a single microphone waiting in the cone of light. Applause thundered, ecstatic, and the sound rushed into me, into the places that had been trained for it. My hands twitched with muscle memory so strong it made me dizzy. I heard myself laugh the laugh audiences loved because it promised permission, and the room clapped harder. It's closer, until the pressure behind my eyes ached. "Just one line," the house whispered. "Wearing my voice now, wearing my timing. Just show them you're still here." The seduction was perfect because it offered relief as professionalism, silence as failure. And for a terrifying instant, I wanted to step into the light and finish the thought it had started for me. I didn't. I dropped to my knees instead, palms flat on the floor, fingers splayed, grounding myself in texture and cold, and I spoke into the space between breaths, not loud enough to echo. "This isn't a show," I said. "It's a boundary." The theater flickered, seats emptying like a bad idea, losing momentum, applause thinning to a few stubborn claps that tried to hold the rhythm together by force. The microphone fell with a metallic ring. The hallway snapped back into itself, shorter than before, as if the house were sulking. By dawn, the clapping had retreated to a dull ache behind my ribs, a bruise rather than a drum, and I knew the stalemate couldn't last. Things like this don't stop because you refuse them once. They stop because you make refusal boring. That afternoon, I did the least theatrical thing I could think of. I invited people over, not an audience company. I called my sister and told her I needed help with a wall. I called a neighbor and asked if she had spare paint. I opened windows and let the house hear overlapping conversations that went nowhere and resolved nothing. Laughter that didn't build, pauses that didn't ask to be filled. The clapping tried to surface once, a tentative tap from the vent, but it drowned in the mess of ordinary noise and fell silent again. I watched the wall where the room had been grow cooler as the hours passed, like something losing interest. That night, after everyone left and the house settled into a new, smaller quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my hands folded and waited. Not because I expected the applause to return immediately, but because waiting without anticipation is its own kind of denial. The house tested me once more with a single clap from far away, barely audible, like a question asked by someone already half convinced of the answer. I didn't move. I didn't think. I let the moment pass unmarked. The clap didn't come again. Weeks went by. The phantom metronome faded. My hands learned stillness. I stopped flinching at silence and started trusting it again. The way you trust a friend after a long argument, cautiously but honestly. The warm rectangle on the wall cooled completely, paint indistinguishable from paint. And when I knocked on it out of habit one afternoon, the sound was dead and ordinary. No answer. No echo that mattered. I painted over it anyway. Not as an exorcism, but as a reminder that walls are allowed to be walls. On the anniversary of my wife's death, I stood in the hallway and spoke her name once, softly. Not to summon anything, but to acknowledge a loss that deserved to exist without being weaponized. And nothing answered me. No applause. No cadence. Just the house breathing the way houses do when they're done performing. I felt watched then, yes, but not by hunger, by absence. The kind that respects a closed door. I learned the last lesson quietly. The way most important lessons arrive when you stop auditioning for them. Participation is not the same thing as presence. You can be here without giving anything away. You can refuse the rhythm without denying the music ever existed. And if something asks you to perform your grief back to it, you don't owe it a curtain call. You owe yourself the discipline to leave the stage empty and let the silence stand without applause.